What is going on, everybody? Cryo here, bringing you another thorough dungeon guide. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Theater of Pain, one of my personal favorites aesthetically and mechanically, so let's get into it. On your way to the first boss, you will encounter only 3 mobs, so don't blow all your cooldowns right away. The Unyielding Contender. These will deal a decent amount of physical damage to your tanks with Vicious Strike. This is further bolstered by their cast of Death Wish. While buffed, contenders will take 20% increased physical damage, but also deal 20% more. This is an enraged effect that can be removed. Players should also be mindful of their charge. As long as they are within 7 yards or further than 25 yards, you should be safe. Battlefield Ritualists. These have 2 interruptible casts. Necrotic Bolt is the generic frequently cast burst damaging spell. Interrupt as many as you can, however the highest priority goes to Unholy Fervor. This cast will buff its target, healing them for 6% every time they deal damage. This can be purged. Raging Bloodhorn. This mounted NPC will use Raging Tantrum. This is an AoE ability that deals physical damage to all party members. Players can soothe this to interrupt it. Horn Rush is an avoidable attack that players should sidestep out of. The first boss encounter is an Affront of Challengers and actually consists of confronting 3 bosses: Desia the Decapitator, Passaran the Virulent, and Sathel the Accursed. Each contender has their own set of abilities and one unique ability upon reaching 40%. On Mythic difficulty only, Zira the Underhanded will also appear periodically. Zira will ambush random players, stunning them for 10 seconds and dealing physical damage until interrupted. Party members should be on the lookout for her appearance and try to use a stun or displacement to save their friends. Starting with Sathel the Accursed. Sathel's generic abilities include Necromantic Bolt, a typical shadow damage cast that can be interrupted. Searing Death, a dot that is placed on a random party member that will deal shadow damage to anyone within 3 yards of the victim. And Spectral Transference. This acts very similar to Unholy Fervor, as in Sathel will choose a random ally and mark them. This marked ally will receive healing every time Sathel deals damage. Players will want to dispel this buff ASAP. Upon reaching 40%, Sathel will cast One with Death. This will give Sathel an Absorb Shield and become immune to interrupt effects for 30 seconds, or until the shield is broken. Moving on to Passaran the Virulent. This challenger will only have 2 main abilities: Plague Bolt, the generic spellcast that can be interrupted, and Noxious Spores, AoE ground effects depicted by green swirlies that players should avoid standing in to reduce their damage taken. On Mythic difficulty, these spores will also slow players. Upon reaching 40%, Passaran will cast Genetic Alteration, causing all players to drop spores every 8 seconds near their location. Finally, we have Desia the Decapitator, arguably the most frustrating contender to deal with in a pug scenario. More on that in just a second. Desia will mainly focus on the tank, casting a Tank Buster Slam that deals heavy physical damage paired with Mortal Strike, an attack that will reduce the healing a tank can receive by 30% for 10 seconds. Now this does not seem too hectic, and you are right. However, upon reaching 40%, Desia will decide to enrage, shielding herself and fixating on a random player for 30 seconds. While enraged, Desia will move 15% slower, but will retain all of her abilities, meaning she can and will cast Slam on unsuspecting DPS players that fail to kite out the enraged. This enraged can be dispelled and is highly encouraged. Desia will most likely be the first or second contender to die due to the simple fact that she is a melee NPC and will always be within cleave range. The TLDR for this boss is cleave all the bosses down if your group can handle the overlap of mechanics. If not, simply avoid pushing each mob to 40% until you are ready. Groups will typically kill Sathel, Desia, and then Passaran, but it is group discretion. And lastly, do not forget about the mythic-only mob Zira. Interrupt her with a stun, grip, or displacement of some kind. After defeating the Affront of Challengers, and after a few seconds of RP, your party will be dropped into the pit below. On your way to the second, third, and fourth boss, you will encounter 3 unique corridors. The choice is irrelevant, although some corridors are far easier than others. Let's start with the Chamber of Conquest by heading off down the southeastern corridor. Shambling Arbalists. These typical archers will constantly cast Shoot. This is uninterruptible minor physical damage. They will occasionally cast Jagged Quarrel as well, dealing a burst of physical damage and leaving behind a dot. Ossified Conscript will only deal physical damage to their targets via crude slash. Ancient Captains will have an aura around them commanding presence. This will increase damage dealt by 25% and reduce the amount of AoE damage taken by 75%. What this means is single target down the captain first, and then your group can AoE the rest of the pack. Now, there will be 6 larger mini-bosses along the path to Xav the Unfallen. They will duel each other, and your group will only face the winner. However, sometimes they do not become hostile after winning their duel, and I'm unsure if this is a bug or intended. Regardless, their positions will rotate, and once you learn their abilities, they are all pretty much the same. Nekthara the Mangler will cast Interrupting Roar, pretty self-explanatory. Whirling Blades are cast on player locations, simply move out of them. And Whirlwind is a melee ranged AoE, run out of its range to avoid the damage. Even the Breaker will also cast Interrupting Roar. Ground Smash is a frontal cone ability that targets a random player. Move out of its animation if you do not wish to be stunned. Tanks will have to deal with Colossus Smash, a debuff that will increase physical damage taken by 50%. Dokig the Brutalizer. First we have Savage Flurry. This is a channeled ability that deals rapid physical damage for 4 seconds. Dokig will buff himself with Battle Trance, shielding him and allowing him to attack much faster. This can be interrupted and purged, or party members can damage through the shield to end it. Brutal Leap, just like it sounds, is a telegraphed leap that will deal physical damage upon completion. Move out of it. Harugia the Bloodthirsty. Ricocheting Blade will mark a player, and at the end of the cast, Harugia will hurl a blade at said player. The blade will deal physical damage and has the ability to ricochet to other players within 5 yards of the primary victim. Harugia also maintains the Battle Trance ability. And lastly, Bloodthirsty Charge. Harugia will telegraph a charge location, and upon reaching the location will cast a Whirlwind ability, move out of it at least 8 yards. Advent Nevermore will also have the Ricocheting Blade ability. She will also cast Seismic Stomp and Unbreakable Guard. The Stomp is unavoidable unless you move out more than 60 yards, and the Guard will create a frontal barrier. Simply move behind the barrier to damage the mini-boss. Wreck the Hardened will continuously buff themselves with Swift Strikes. This will allow Wreck to attack 50% faster, but also cleave 2 more players for 30% of the damage dealt to the tank. Whirlwind, we already know what to do here. And lastly, Unbalancing Blow. This will inflict physical damage, but more importantly, reduce your tank's chance to dodge, parry, and block by 100%. Xav the Unfallen is a fairly quick encounter with dance-like mechanics, but introduces a new duel style mechanic. Starting with the top platform, tanks will have to deal with Brutal Combo. This acts as the tank buster for this fight, and Xav will perform a series of brutal melee strikes that inflict increasing physical damage to his target. Be sure to keep your active mitigation up during this. Oppressive Banners will be placed throughout the fight, reducing the party's movement speed by 15% every 3 seconds. Deal with these quickly in order to avoid the next mechanic, Might of Maldraxxus. Xav will leap to the center of the arena, inflicting physical damage to all players and perform a random combination of attacks. This is the dance. Crushing Slam inflicts physical damage to players in a line in front of Xav. Massive Cleave slashes in a frontal hemisphere, inflicting physical damage to all players struck. On Mythic difficulty and higher, Xav will also cast Deafening Crash. Stomping, Xav will interrupt all spellcasting within 55 yards for 2 seconds, inflicting physical damage and knocking back players within 12 yards. All of these abilities are highly telegraphed with ground effects. Do your best to avoid them all. The new dueling mechanic starts when Xav reaches 100 energy. He will force 2 players into the bottom platform below, and they will become hostile towards one another. While fighting, the dueling participants will gain a stacking debuff, Glorious Combat. This increases the damage they take by 3% every second. The selected players also only have 45 seconds to defeat each other, or they will both become affected by Cowardice, reducing their damage done by 10% for 20 seconds. The player who wins the duel will be buffed with Glorified and will deal 10% increased damage for 20 seconds, whilst the defeated player will be debuffed with Bloodied and will deal 10% decreased damage for 20 seconds. It will be interesting to see how coordinated groups are able to put their pride aside and buff the player that will benefit the most from the 20 seconds of increased damage. The TLDR for this fight is throw on your dancing shoes and dodge mechanics. Tanks be sure to mitigate brutal combo, healers help them out, and everyone focus down banners ASAP as to not get slowed. While dueling, make a decision if you want to try and win or lose quickly to get it over with. Just remember, you both lose if no one is defeated within 45 seconds, and that is 45 seconds you weren't helping to kill the boss. Upon defeating Xav the Unfallen, jump down the ledge and head back into the main room where all the corridors split. Once you are back in the main room, head to the northernmost corridor. This will take us to the second easiest section, the Altar of Agony. Here we will be introduced to Shackled Soul. These ghosts will cast two abilities. Bind Soul will snare targets and deal shadow damage. This can and should be interrupted. Soul Touch, however, is not interruptible and deals a burst of shadow damage. While fighting these, Kul'tharok will be splashing shadow damage onto the path. Do your best to avoid these or line of sight the Shackled Souls to negate it entirely. Portal Guardians. These are important mobs since they will allow party members to access the necrotic gates in order to reach further platforms. These mobs will affect random players with Shadow Vulnerability, increasing the amount of shadow damage they take. You can remove this curse. Soulstorm is an AoE that deals shadow damage. As long as you are not afflicted by Shadow Vulnerability, the damage should be manageable. Upon death, these Portal Guardians will drop a strange orb. Pick up the orb and place it in a nearby orb holder. This will activate the necrotic gate. Placing the orb does not really matter, just know that if you drop it in the left holder, you will likely go to the left platform next. Again, much like the Spires of Ascension, the path you choose does not matter until you are looking to push Mythic Plus for time, and at that time we will break it down and figure out which is the best path, but for now, just experiment, as all paths will lead you to the boss in relatively the same amount of time. Now some of the mobs you will encounter, regardless of which path you choose. Maniacal Soulbinder. Necrotic Bolt is the generic spellcast that not only deals a burst of shadow damage, but also absorbs healing taken. Interrupt when you can, but the priority is Necrotic Bolt Volley. Similar to the generic Bolt, however this will strike all enemies. Nefarious Darkspeaker. Spirit Frost is the generic spell cast here, interrupt when you can. Curse of Desolation will cause the afflicted player to drop pools at their feet every 3 seconds. If standing in the pool, players will take damage and be feared. This can be detrimental due to the next ability, Death Wins. This ability will target a random player, and upon completion of its cast, a tornado will spawn and launch forward. If players are struck by the tornado, they will be launched off the platform. You can try to use abilities to stop yourself from launching too far, but you have to act very quickly. It's best to just avoid the Death Winds altogether. Bone Magus. These will have a bone shield around them absorbing damage. Either break it with brute force or purge it. Bone Spear impales the target, inflicting physical damage, and leaves a dot for 4 seconds. This should be interrupted. Grave Spike is another interruptible cast, however this one is telegraphed with a ground animation and can be dodged. Should you stand in the spike, you will take physical damage. Soul Forged Bone Reaver. This mob will cast Bone Spikes. This is a channeled ability, and while channeling, bone spikes will erupt from the ground. Dodge them. Bone Storm. We already know what this iconic ability does. Kul'tharok can be viewed as a healer-intensive encounter and very boring for tanks. With that said, let's talk about the tank mechanics. First off, stand in melee range. Secondly, nope, that's it. Kul'tharok will only cast Spectral Reach if her primary target is not within melee range. However, this only punishes the tank. If struck by Spectral Reach, you will take shadow damage and receive a dot. So, stand in melee range of the boss and DPS your heart out. While engaged with Kul'tharok, all party members will take a tick of shadow damage every 3 seconds due to the Chill of the Beyond aura. This is unavoidable, and healers just need to be ready for a constant stream of AoE healing throughout the fight. Occasionally, Kul'tharok attaches a phantasmal parasite to a random player that inflicts shadow damage to the target and all players within 3 yards every 1 second for 10 seconds. Just be sure to spread out to minimize the cleave damage. Throughout the encounter, players will also notice grasping hand pools. These pools will bind both players and their souls, immobilizing them for 10 seconds. Players immobilized this way take additional shadow damage every 1 second for 10 seconds. These pools are extremely important for the next mechanic, Draw Soul. Kul'tharok draws out the soul of 2 random players. While separated from their soul, the player's body suffers shadow damage every 1 second and prevents all actions in spellcasting, and the soul runs around aimlessly. This will last for 20 seconds, and players must reclaim their soul by running into it, and in doing so, they will be granted a huge buff that increases all damage dealt by 30% for 30 seconds. On Mythic difficulty and higher, failing to reacquire your soul results in becoming a host for a hostile soul within the room. While possessed, the hostile soul forces your body to attack your allies. Now, do you remember those pools we talked about earlier? If you are selected by Draw Soul, it is in your best interest to run behind one of those pools, placing it between you and Kul'tharok. Souls will always travel toward the boss first, and by positioning yourself this way causes the soul to be trapped. This makes it much easier to recapture. Keep in mind this will consume the pool, but fun fact, both players can use the same pool as long as their souls trigger the trap at the same time. The TLDR for this fight is tanks remain inside Kul'tharok's melee range to prevent casts of Spectral Reach. Healers be ready to heal soulless party members until they reclaim their souls, and players remember to use Grasping Hand pools to easily trap your wandering souls. Failure to recapture your soul causes you to take an absurd amount of damage and will likely end in your demise on Mythic difficulty and higher. Upon defeating Kul'tharok, use the portal to get to the lower ledge and head back into the main room where the corridors split. Once you are back in the main room, head to the northwesternmost corridor when looking at the map. This will take us to our final and most difficult section, the Barrow of Carnage. This section has a lot of leaping mobs that are hard to group up, as well as an absurdly large amount of disease and poison effects, so the damage output is extremely high. This is the reason this can be seen as the hardest section of the dungeon, but let's get back to the trash. Diseased Horror. These large mobs will mostly cast Decaying Strike, dealing physical damage and leaving behind Decaying Blight, a dot that reduces the target's max health by 5% for 30 seconds. This dot does refresh and stack. Diseased Horrors will also cast Meat Shield. Interrupt this ASAP to avoid having to deal with the damage absorbed. Disgusting Refuse. These are the culprits that are difficult to gather up. They will continuously cast Leaping Thrash, jumping to a random player and dealing a 360-degree AoE cleave. Stacking up is the easiest way to group these mobs together, but will also place you in range of all the cleaves. Upon death, these will leave a green pool that explodes. If you are within the blast radius, you will be afflicted by the dot Withering Blight. This dot deals plague damage every 5 seconds, and players afflicted will deal 20% less damage and healing for 30 seconds. Putrid Butcher. This mob will mainly cast Chop, targeting a random player and dealing physical damage and leaving a minor bleed effect. Devour Flesh will also inflict physical damage, however, it will also heal the Butcher for 300% of the damage dealt. He remains stationary while casting this ability, so players should move out 8 yards to avoid the heal. Blighted Sludge Spewer. These will also leap to random players, making them difficult to group up. They will cast Decaying Filth, dealing damage and afflicting the target with Decaying Blight. Spewers will also cast Withering Discharge, afflicting every party member with Withering Blight. As you can see, getting multiple stacks of this disease can spell disaster for your parties and should be managed by interrupting the appropriate spells and dispelling as quickly as you can. Rancid Gas Bag. These big guys will only cast 2 abilities aside from their regular melee attacks. Vile Eruption is a frontal and tail swipe-like cast that will deal damage to any player struck by it. To dodge this, simply stand on the gas bag's sides. This mob does rotate and select random targets to cast Vile Eruption, so there is no way for tanks to position it that allows DPS and healers to never have to move. Disease Cloud is an aura that gas bags have, and will deal damage to all nearby players every 2 seconds while in combat. The Rancid Gas Bag will periodically cast Rancid Bile Pools on the ground, depicted by green swirlies, and standing in the pool will slow movement speed by 50% and deal nature damage. That is all for trash, and even though there are only 5 different mobs, the layout of the dungeon and the combination in which you face these mobs will set your group up for some hectic pulls. I recommend taking your time until everyone is a tad more familiar. Gorechop, a seemingly underwhelming boss, but let's get to it. To start, tanks will need to be ready for Hateful Strike. This deals heavy physical damage and should be mitigated. On Mythic difficulty, Gorechop will also cast Tenderizing Smash, pulling in all players and smashing the ground, inflicting physical damage and knocking back players struck. The grip can be avoided, or the travel time can be lessened by remaining close to Gorechop. This allows players to move out of the smash much easier. The last obvious mechanic is Meat Hooks. Meat Hooks descend and sweep across the arena. Players that are struck by the Meat Hook are stunned and suffer Jagged Gash, a bleed effect lasting 8 seconds. There are always at least 2 openings in the hooks. Players should do their best to use these to dodge the mechanic. You will notice oozing leftovers running around the room as well. All leftovers will unravel themselves, losing 5% of their maximum health every 1 second. And although these mobs have a threat table, they will leap to a random player, making it almost impossible for tanks to scoop them up. When the oozing leftovers die, they will leave behind a pool of coagulated ooze. This will deal damage and slow movement speed, so try to avoid them. And that's pretty much it. TLDR for this boss: tanks mitigate Hateful Strike, and everybody run out of Tenderizing Smash and dodge the Meat Hooks. The oozing leftovers are a minor nuisance that will eventually fall over, so do not worry too much about them, just avoid the pools they drop. Upon defeating Gorechop, use the Meat Hooks in the south of the room while looking at the map to get back up and head into the main room where the corridors split. Once you are back in the main room, click on the orb in the center. This will take us back up to the surface where we will face the final boss. Mordretha, the Endless Empress, will be our final encounter, and honestly this 5-man dungeon boss reminds me of a raid boss. There are just so many mechanics happening. This can be classified as a 2-phase encounter, although this only occurs on Mythic difficulty and when Mordretha reaches 50% health, so more on that later. Starting off, tanks will have to deal with the Reaping Scythe. This tank buster does not cleave, although it looks like it would, and deals a massive chunk of physical and shadow damage. Be sure to mitigate this as best you can. Dark Devastation is a massive beam of anima that will rotate, dealing damage every 0.5 seconds and pushing back players within it. This will hurt, so players should avoid it altogether. The Grasping Rift mechanic is fairly simple. Avoid being pulled into the rift by running against it. Manifest Death is its own mechanic, although it does seem like it is tied to Grasping Rift. I assure you it is not. Manifest Death will target all players, dealing shadow damage every 2 seconds for 3 seconds. When this expires, it will deal a burst of shadow damage to the player and anyone within 6 yards. On Mythic difficulty, players will also spawn a Deathwalker upon the expiration of Manifest Death. These Deathwalkers will only cast Death Bolt, dealing minor damage, and can be interrupted. It is in the party's best interest to group these mobs up as close as they can for cleave and AoE stun or interrupt effects. If you are on Mythic difficulty and higher, you will have one more mechanic to deal with, and that is Echoes of Carnage. Upon reaching 50% health remaining, Mordretha conjures Echoes of Carnage for the remainder of the encounter. Echoes of Carnage inflict shadow damage to all players instantly and every 2 seconds thereafter. Avoid being inside their ghostly swirls. Ghostly riders will spawn 4 at a time and run straight through the room. Be on your toes and dodge them, they will hurt. That is the entire fight, and the overlapping of the mechanics is what really ups the difficulty factor. Every player must individually watch out for themselves or perish quickly. The TLDR for this fight is tanks mitigate Reaping Scythe, everyone should dodge the rotating Dark Devastation, and avoid being dragged into the Grasping Rift. Do your best to stack up during Manifest Death to place spawning Deathwalkers close to each other, but not so close that you blow each other up. Dodge all forms of swirly ghosts, and you'll be fine. That's it for this one, folks. I appreciate you stopping by. I hope you learned something, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Stay frosty.